My name is Samuel Tucker, and I've been working at the First National Bank of Cedar Ridge for nigh on 15 years now. I've seen plenty of folks come through those heavy oak doors. Ranchers looking to expand their herds, shopkeepers needing funds for inventory, and desperate souls trying to save their homesteads. But I'll tell you, that morning in September of 1887 was unlike any other I'd witnessed. The autumn air carried a crisp bite as I unlocked the bank's front door, the brass bell chiming its familiar greeting. Cedar Ridge was just stirring to life. Mrs. Henderson sweeping her porch across the dusty main street, old Pete leading his mule-drawn cart toward the general store, and the distant sound of hammers from the new schoolhouse construction echoing. Through the valley, I'd barely settled behind my teller window when she walked in. She was a woman of perhaps 35 years, dressed in a simple but well-made traveling dress of deep blue wool. Her auburn hair was pinned up proper-like, and though her clothes showed signs of a long journey, there was something about her bearing that commanded respect. She carried herself with a quiet dignity that spoke of education and refinement, unusual for our frontier town. "Good morning," she said, her voice clear and measured. "I'd like to speak with someone about securing a loan." I nodded toward Mr. Cornelius Blackwood's office. Blackwood was our head clerk, a man who'd arrived from back east about 5 years prior, full of big city ideas and an unfortunate tendency to judge folks by their appearance rather than their character. He wore his authority like an ill-fitting coat, always eager to remind everyone of his position. "Mr. Blackwood handles our lending matters, ma'am. I'll let him know you're here." I knocked on his door and announced the visitor. Through the glass partition, I watched as the woman entered his office, hat in hand. What I witnessed over the next 30 minutes would stick with me for the rest of my days. Through the thin walls, I could hear snippets of their conversation. The woman introduced herself as Margaret O'Sullivan, recently arrived from San Francisco. She spoke with quiet confidence about her plans to establish a business in Cedar Ridge, something about a boarding house and restaurant for travelers passing through on the new railroad line. Blackwood's responses grew increasingly dismissive. I heard him shuffling papers with unnecessary force, the scrape of his chair as he leaned back, and finally his voice rising just enough for me to catch his words clearly. "Mrs. O'Sullivan, I'm afraid the bank simply cannot extend credit to someone in your particular circumstances. A woman, traveling alone, with no local references or established business history in our community. Surely you understand the risks involved." The silence that followed was deafening. I found myself leaning closer to the partition, my hands stilled. Over the ledger I'd been updating, when Margaret finally spoke, her voice remained steady, though I detected the slightest tremor beneath her composure. "Mr. Blackwood, I have the deed to a substantial property in San Francisco, letters of credit from Wells Fargo, and a detailed business plan. I'm not asking for charity. I'm proposing a mutually beneficial arrangement." "Ma'am," Blackwood's tone dripped with condescension, "running a business requires more than good intentions. It requires experience, connections, and frankly, the respect of the community. I simply cannot recommend approval for this loan." What happened next made my blood run cold. I heard the rustle of papers being pushed across the desk, followed by Blackwood's final crushing words. "Perhaps you might consider returning to San Francisco, where opportunities for someone like yourself might be more readily available." The office door opened, and Margaret O'Sullivan emerged. Her face was composed, but I could see the fire burning behind her green eyes. She paused at my window, and for a moment our gazes met. "Mr. Tucker, isn't it?" she asked, having heard Blackwood use my name earlier. "Yes, ma'am. You've been working here a long time, I gather." 15 years come Christmas, ma'am." She nodded slowly, then reached into her traveling bag and withdrew a small leather portfolio. "I wonder if you might do me a favor. When the bank opens tomorrow morning, would you please ensure that Mr. Blackwood receives this?" She handed me an envelope, sealed with red wax. "Of course, ma'am." And Mr. Tucker. She paused at the door, her hand on the brass handle. Sometimes the most important lessons come from the most unexpected teachers. With that, she stepped out into the dusty street, leaving me holding the envelope and wondering what storm was about to break over our quiet little town. The rest of that day passed in a strange haze. Blackwood emerged from his office an hour later, looking pleased with himself. "Another dreamer thinking the frontiers paved with gold," he muttered to me as he passed. Did her a favor, really. Saved her from certain failure. But something about Margaret O'Sullivan told me she wasn't the type to be easily discouraged. As I locked up the bank that evening, watching the sun paint the mountains in shades of gold and crimson, I had the distinct feeling that this story was far from over. Little did I know that by tomorrow evening, everything I thought I knew about power, pride, and the true measure of a person would be turned completely upside down. I arrived at work the next morning to find Cedar Ridge buzzing, with activity unlike anything I'd seen since the railroad announcement 2 years prior. Folks were clustered in small groups along the main street, their voices carrying an undercurrent of excitement and disbelief. "Samuel!" called out Doc Morrison from across the street. "You hear the news about the old Hartwell building?" The Hartwell building was the largest structure in town, a 3-story brick edifice that housed not only our bank on the ground floor, but also several other businesses and offices above. Old man Hartwell had passed the previous spring, and his widow had been looking to sell ever since. "Can't say I have, Doc. What's the word? Sold overnight. Cash transaction, they say. New owners planning some big changes." I felt a peculiar chill run down my spine as I unlocked the bank's front door. The envelope Margaret O'Sullivan had left for Blackwood was still in my vest pocket, and suddenly it felt heavier than lead. Blackwood arrived 20 minutes later, his usual pompous stride carrying him through the lobby. "Morning, Tucker. Trust yesterday's unpleasantness with that O'Sullivan woman didn't disrupt your work too much." "Actually, sir, she left this for you." I handed him the envelope, watching his face carefully. He examined the wax seal with mild curiosity before breaking it open. I tried to focus on my morning ledger entries, but I couldn't help watching his expression change as he read. His face went from casual indifference to confusion, then to something approaching panic. "Tucker!" he barked, his voice cracking slightly. "Get in here, now!" I found him standing behind his desk, the letter trembling in his hands. His usually immaculate appearance was already disheveled, despite the early hour. "Read this," he commanded, thrusting the paper at me. The letter was written in Margaret's clear, educated hand. "Dear Mr. Blackwood, thank you for your time yesterday morning. Your decision regarding my loan application has been noted and will be remembered accordingly. I thought you might be interested to know that I completed the purchase of the Hartwell building last evening. The transaction was conducted through Wells Fargo Bank in San Francisco, using funds from my late husband's estate, copper mining interests in Montana, among other investments. As the new owner of this building, I will be reviewing all existing lease agreements, including that of the First National Bank of Cedar Ridge. I trust this will not cause any undue concern, as I'm sure a man of your business acumen will understand that property owners must make decisions based on what's best for their investments. I remain, with professional regards, Margaret O'Sullivan, P.S. The boarding house and restaurant will be opening next month. All are welcome." The silence in that office was deafening. I watched Blackwood's face cycle through a rainbow of emotions: disbelief, anger, fear, and finally, a sickly sort of understanding. This can't be right," he stammered. "She's bluffing. She has to be." But even as he spoke, we could hear commotion outside. Through the window, I could see a small crowd gathering around a well-dressed gentleman who was posting notices on various storefronts. The man's clothes and bearing marked him as a lawyer, probably from the Territorial. Capital. I'll be right back, I told Blackwood, though he barely seemed to hear me. Outside, I pushed through the growing crowd to read the notice the lawyer was posting on the bank's front window. Notice of ownership change. The building known as the Hartwell property, located at 142 Main Street, Cedar Ridge Territory, has been sold to Mrs. Margaret O'Sullivan, effective immediately. All tenants will receive formal notification of lease terms within 7 business days. Signed, Harrison and Associates, Territorial Attorneys. Excuse me, sir, I called to the lawyer. I work in the bank here. Is this legitimate? The man turned to me with the patient expression of someone who'd answered the same question 12 times already. Completely legitimate, I assure you. Mrs. O'Sullivan's funds cleared through Wells Fargo yesterday evening. The deed transfer has been filed with the Territorial Office in Helena. What about the bank's lease? That would be between Mrs. O'Sullivan and your bank's management. I believe she plans to discuss terms personally. As if summoned by our conversation, Margaret O'Sullivan appeared at the far end of the street. She was dressed more formally today, a traveling suit of charcoal grey with a matching hat, looking every inch the successful businesswoman. Behind her walked 2 men in work clothes, carrying surveying equipment. The crowd parted as she approached, and I found myself stepping aside as well. She paused at the bank's entrance, her eyes meeting mine through the window, where Blackwood stood frozen, still clutching her letter. "Good morning, Mr. Tucker," she said pleasantly. "Lovely day, isn't it?" "Yes, ma'am." "It surely is." She glanced at the notice on the window, then back at me. "I trust Mr. Blackwood received my correspondence?" "He did, ma'am. He's processing the information." A small smile played at the corners of her mouth. "I'm sure he is. Would you be so kind as to let him know I'll be by this afternoon to discuss the bank's lease arrangement, say around 2 o'clock? "Of course, ma'am." As she continued down the street with her surveyors, I heard old Pete's voice rise above the murmur of the crowd. "Well, I'll be damned. Ain't that something?" It surely was something. But as I watched Margaret O'Sullivan examine her new property, with the careful eye of a woman who knew exactly what she was about, I realized this was just the beginning. When I returned to Blackwood's office, I found him slumped in his chair, staring at the letter as if it might change its contents through sheer force of will. "She wants to meet at 2 o'clock, I told him, about the lease." He looked up at me then, and for the first time since I'd known him, Cornelius Blackwood looked like exactly what he was, a small man who'd made a very big mistake. "Tucker," he said quietly, "I think I may have just ruined us all." By 2 o'clock. That afternoon, the bank lobby was fuller than I'd ever seen it. Half the town had found excuses to be there, sensing that something important was about to happen. Blackwood had spent the morning pacing his office like a trapped animal, his usual arrogance replaced by the desperate fear of a man who'd just realized the gravity of his mistake. "She's here," I announced as Margaret O'Sullivan appeared in the doorway. The lobby fell silent as she approached, wearing a dress of deep forest green and carrying herself with quiet purpose. Every conversation stopped, as if the entire town was holding its breath. I led her to Blackwood's office, where he stood behind his desk, pale and trembling. "Mrs. O'Sullivan," he began, his voice barely a whisper, "I believe there may have been some misunderstanding." "Please sit down, Mr. Blackwood," Margaret interrupted gently. "Both of you!" As we took our seats, she settled into the same chair she'd occupied the day before, though now the power dynamic had shifted completely. "What happened yesterday was not a misunderstanding," she began. "You made a decision based on assumptions about who I am. Those assumptions were wrong." She paused, her steady gaze never leaving Blackwood's face. "My husband died in a mining accident 2 years ago. After his death, people assumed our business would fail, that a woman couldn't possibly manage finances or earn the respect necessary for success. I proved them wrong by expanding our operations and selling everything for considerable profit. Blackwood's face flushed red. Mrs. O'Sullivan, I sincerely apologize. I'm not finished. The question now is what to do about it. The silence felt endless. Through the walls we could hear the murmur of voices from the lobby. I could terminate your lease, Margaret continued, force the bank to relocate. I could make things very difficult for you professionally, but I don't believe in revenge for its own sake. I believe in education. She reached into her bag and placed a leather folder on the desk. This is my original loan application with all supporting documentation. I want you to review it properly, every page, every figure, then make the decision you should have made yesterday. Blackwood stared at the folder. I don't understand. It's simple. If you believe the loan is sound after proper review, we'll proceed with my original terms. If not, you'll explain your reasoning in writing based on actual merits. Either way, you'll have done your job properly. She stood, smoothing her skirts. You have until Friday. Your lease continues under current terms. At the door, she turned back one final time. Mr. Blackwood, you have an opportunity here to show this community and yourself what kind of man you really are. I hope you won't waste it. 3 days later, Blackwood emerged from his office with tired eyes but a straight back. Tucker, he said quietly, send word to Mrs. O'Sullivan. Tell her the First National Bank would be honored to approve her loan application. That moment taught me something powerful. Sometimes the greatest strength isn't in destroying your enemies. It's in giving them the chance to become better than they ever imagined they could be. Margaret O'Sullivan didn't just win that day. She transformed our entire community, showing us what real grace looks like under pressure.